She would wake up every morning at 6, religiously, lovingly make coffee, and place his favorite cup on the table. This routine had lasted decades. Nancy, a 72-year-old woman, thought she knew her husband's every move. John was her lifelong companion, with whom she'd shared silences and laughter since high school. At least, that's what she thought. They lived in a small town in rural North Carolina, where everyone knew each other by their first names and time seemed to move more slowly. Life there was peaceful, marked by Sunday services, afternoons on the porch, and summer visits from grandchildren. Nancy often said that growing old with someone was a blessing, and that only love held a house together for so many years. But even the most solid homes can hide invisible cracks. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also want to take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot, thank you. Now, get ready, because what Nancy discovered will move you in a way you may never have felt before. One day, while cleaning out the guest room closet, she found a silk scarf with a strange scent. It wasn't hers, nor her daughter's. John said he used the room as a makeshift office, but Nancy had never paid attention to the details. For the first time in years, she felt her heart race strangely. A flea in her ear. Something didn't quite fit. Little by little, she began to notice patterns she'd previously ignored. John was frequently going for walks that lasted longer than usual. His cell phone, previously left on the table, was now always in his pocket. And there were smiles that seemed to creep into his lips, as if he were keeping secrets. Nancy tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was just age, or was it? One night, she dreamed of her wedding day. John wore a light blue suit, and she wore a lace dress borrowed from her sister. She remembered how he held her hand and promised eternal love. She woke with tears in her eyes. There was something in that dream that felt like a warning. A call from the heart to see what the eyes refused to see. Determined, she began to jot down notes in a worn notebook. Every departure, every return, every new excuse. She wasn't a suspicious woman by nature, but she had learned from life that sometimes the soul feels before the mind understands. And what Nancy's heart felt was a mixture of fear, doubt, and a sadness that came without asking for permission. That same week, while sorting through old papers, she found a credit card account in John's name. Nothing unusual, until she saw the name of a restaurant in Charleston. They hadn't traveled in years. The detail. The date. He said he was on a church retreat that weekend. But Nancy knew that restaurant well. It was romantic. It was expensive. It was where couples went to celebrate their love. She tried to confront him, but something inside urged patience. Instead of accusing, she decided to observe. She remembered the verse from Proverbs that said, "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom." So she waited. She prayed every day, asking God for clarity, serenity, and courage. Because knowing the truth can be liberating, but it can also hurt more than 1,000 lies. John seemed increasingly distant. He didn't fight, didn't argue, just smiled hollowly and said he was tired. Nancy began to feel like a shadow in her own house. Still, she put dinner on the table, made his bed, and folded his clothes with love. Not for him, but for herself. Because her essence was caring, even when her heart screamed for answers. Then, one Friday afternoon, something completely unexpected happened. Nancy received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was female, and nervous. "I need to talk to you. It's about John." She froze. Time seemed to stand still. What could be so urgent that a stranger would be looking for a wife after so many years of marriage? The woman on the other end arranged a meeting. A discreet cafe in a neighboring town. Nancy considered not going 1,000 times. But something told her she had to weather this storm. She put on her best wool coat, put on some subtle lipstick, and drove alone. On the way, she listened to an old CD with hymns that reminded her of her youth. Her heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo inside the car. Upon arriving, she recognized the woman immediately. Brown hair, light eyes, a restrained elegance. She was the same woman from an old photo John kept in his desk drawer. My God! Nancy thought. This was Margaret. The distant cousin John claimed to have met again at a funeral years ago. But what no one knew was what Margaret was about to reveal. I loved John for many years, but I never thought he would lie to you all that time. Margaret said it with teary eyes, as if carrying guilt and relief at the same time. Nancy felt as if the ground had fallen away. The pieces were beginning to fit together, and the puzzle revealed a picture she never imagined she would see. But Margaret wasn't there just to confess. She brought something more, a box. Inside, letters exchanged over nearly 20 years. Travel photos, souvenirs, notes. Evidence. So much evidence that Nancy felt a wave of nausea. John wasn't just cheating on her. He was living a parallel life, with feelings, promises, and plans for the future. Nancy didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't react like in the movies. She simply thanked him, got up, and left silently. Inside the car, she sat for long minutes, breathing deeply. Everything seemed surreal. It was as if she had left her own body and was watching her story being told by someone else. A woman stronger than she imagined herself to be. When she got home, John still hadn't returned. She went to her bedroom, opened the window, and let the wind in. For the first time in decades, she slept alone by choice. But that night would only be the beginning. Because what would come next, no one could have predicted. Nancy woke with a strange serenity. The pain was there, of course. But there was also a sense that God was carrying her in his arms. Like in that famous story of the footprints in the sand. She made coffee just for herself, put the bread in the toaster, and turned on the radio. A song was playing, "It Is Well With My Soul." She smiled, though with tears in her eyes. And then something unbelievable happened. A neighbor, a longtime friend, knocked on the door with an envelope in her hands. "I think this is yours. They delivered it to my house by mistake." Nancy opened it and found a deed to a property. A plot of land in her name, purchased by John over 15 years ago. But she'd never known it. And the strangest thing, it was in the same town as Margaret. Questions began to pour in. What else didn't she know? Were there other properties? Other women? A second family? Nancy decided she needed help. She sought out her eldest daughter, Susan, who was a lawyer. And when she told her everything, an even bigger twist came to light. Susan knew Margaret, and what she revealed next was like an earthquake. Susan said that years ago, when she was a teenager, she saw John with Margaret in a coffee shop. At the time, she thought it was a coincidence, a chance encounter. But now it all made sense. John had been lying for much longer than anyone had imagined. Nancy felt her heart sink. But she also felt something new, indignation. She returned to writing in her notebook. But now, her words were firm. They were prayers of strength, faith, and discernment. "Lord, guide me. Show me what I must do. I don't want revenge. I want justice. I want peace." And that same night, a verse she had memorized in her youth came back to her, "The truth will set you free." Ever since she opened the box Margaret had left, Nancy couldn't stop thinking about the house's old basement. A room John always said was closed for maintenance. The door creaked strangely, its locks looking like they'd been reinforced long ago. There was a musty smell, a smell of secrets. And something inside her said, "Go down. See what it hides." She spent days staring at the doorknob, touching the wood against her palm. But the fear of facing yet another betrayal nearly paralyzed her. The hallway lights flickered at night, and she lay awake listening to the echo of footsteps as if someone were walking downstairs, but John was asleep. Nancy's heart ached with doubt, and she knew it took divine courage to step into that forbidden territory. That gray morning, she heard a cracking sound coming from the basement. It was too early. The day was still dark, the clock ticking just before 8. The air turned chilly. Nancy froze. In the distance, a door opened by itself? Or was it her mind playing tricks? What no one knew was that that simple sound would change the course of everything, and you won't believe what she found. Nancy descended the steps with an antique lantern, a hand-me-down from her mother. Each step creaked the worn wood. The air was heavy, humid, filled with dust and something almost metallic. She felt the weight of the old house on her shoulders. And something she never expected, it wasn't just a storage room for old objects. There was a hidden space, a door behind a worm-eaten wooden shelf. She pushed the bookcase open. The boards creaked, dust flew. A narrow, dark hallway seemed to continue beyond what the house plans showed. Lantern light wavered on the damp walls. There were nail marks on a small, almost unnoticed, interior door. Nancy hesitated, but something inside her pulled. When she opened the door, she found old boxes sealed with scraped-off postage stamps, papers marked with long-forgotten dates, prescriptions, hotel tickets, checks, and among them, a package containing photographs of an unknown woman. She'd never seen that face. But she looked pained, tears in the photos. Nancy felt a pang of surprise. Who was she? She clutched an envelope bearing Margaret's name, dated many summers ago. Her cousin, her lover, had sent letters recounting promises John had made, promises Nancy had never known. The entire narrative of marriage, of fidelity, seemed to crumble like a house of cards. And the twist, John was in constant contact with Margaret. Even more shocking, it was discovered that Margaret had kept a diary. Not just letters, but a diary John kept secret as well. It recorded confessions, apologies that had never been honest, secret encounters. Nancy read excerpts through silent tears. I promised to break up with her. I love you. But she never did. She closed the journal, the world spinning. She thought about screaming, about confronting John, but she also felt afraid. Exposing herself, breaking everything. Nancy took a deep breath, remembering psalms that spoke of truth and honor. She prayed for God to give her wisdom, to choose the right words. To choose not to destroy, but to know the truth. Back in the living room, Nancy held the stained photos and the wrinkled notes. The weight of betrayal felt physical in her hands. John appeared behind her, silent, his eyes filled with guilt. He asked what she was doing there. Nancy didn't react. She simply held up the diary in a firm voice. Explain. John recoiled, his expression changing. First denial, then shame, then suppressed anger. Nancy expected anything: confession, a lie, an escape. He swallowed hard. He pleaded for calm. He promised an explanation later. But Nancy knew this was the moment to decide: keep pretending or move on. The next day, she returned to the basement and found a key hidden in the ceiling, inside an old vase. It was small and rusty, but it matched a metal door inside the hidden corridor. She'd never seen that door before. He wondered, was there another secret space? More evidence. The implication: he didn't know how much John had lied. Nancy took the key to her lawyer daughter, Susan, asking for help opening the door safely. Susan arrived with leather gloves and a modern flashlight. They descended together. With each step, the tension grew. The silence was total, except for their footsteps. And suddenly, the door opened onto a safe built into the wall. Inside the safe, financial documents, forged certificates, bank accounts in other states, letters confirming that John had invested money in properties in the name of others, possibly Margaret or someone else. Something never suspected: he was hiding assets, hoarding financial secrecy. Nancy felt the ground give way beneath her feet. An even bigger twist: he discovered that part of the money came from her retirement plan, which John managed. He had been embezzling small, almost imperceptible amounts for years to maintain a double life. And not even she, who had supported him for decades, suspected. The betrayal wasn't just of the heart, but of trust, of the future. Nancy wept. Wept with anger, pain, and disappointment. Susan held her hand. You deserve to know everything. Nancy understood she needed to act. But acting wasn't the same as destroying. She wanted justice. And she wanted peace. God, in His love, showed light even in the deepest darkness. After that sleepless night, Nancy slept little, as her dreams were invaded by images of the basement, the hidden door, the papers, the silence. In the dream, John spoke to Margaret, promising worlds he would never fulfill. She woke trembling. But at dawn, she felt a spark of power. She knew she could rebuild her life based on the truth. She began telling church friends, asking for prayers. 2 longtime women, Mary and Louise, overheard and were shocked. Nancy thought she was sharing too much of a secret. Louise held her hand. "You're right to seek the light." Mary said, "The truth may hurt, but it heals." Nancy promised herself no one would live this lie in silence again. But the basement held another secret, a box of photos that included someone Nancy didn't know, a daughter John had had before his marriage with Margaret. A daughter who had been adopted by another family and no one knew about. The implication: Nancy had a silent stepdaughter, someone connected to the hidden part of John's life. This daughter was named Emily, and she lived in another city. Margaret offered small payments, handled correspondence. John sent gifts. Nancy was stunned. The betrayal multiplied. It wasn't just emotional, nor just financial. It was also parental. Her entire life, children, marriage, identity, now had hidden fragments. Nancy decided she needed to talk to Emily. She sent an anonymous letter, inviting her to talk. Emily responded hesitantly. "I always felt like something was missing." They met at a simple coffee shop in suburban Charlotte. Nancy saw in the young woman's eyes a mixture of fear, hope, and sadness. Emily told her she'd grown up with a different mother, that she'd never met John, that she knew about Margaret but thought of her as a distant aunt. She'd never imagined Nancy existed. The revelation shocked Emily, who trembled with emotion. Nancy looked at her and felt compassion, perhaps greater than her grief. The third twist: Emily's presence transformed everything. Nancy asked John about Emily on a silent night in the living room. He didn't deny it, but his voice broke. He begged for forgiveness. He said he thought hiding her would protect everyone. Nancy listened, but didn't know if she could trust again. The wound was deep. She had to decide, face her husband or let bygones be bygones. Despite the betrayal, something new was emerging in Nancy, a sense of independence she hadn't felt since she was young. She felt God's presence whispering in her heart, "You are worth more than the lies that have enveloped you." That's when she understood. The secret hidden in the basement wasn't just about John, it was about herself, about her worth. The climax began when Nancy, documents in hand, confronted John in front of his children. Susan, Emily, and grandchildren. The entire family gathered. Stories were told. He tried to explain, justify, and improvise lies. But Nancy read the checks, showed him the paperwork, and pointed out every mistake. Pain lit their faces. The truth could no longer be denied. And then something unexpected happened. John, visibly shaken, fainted. Perhaps from guilt, perhaps from shame, or from a sudden illness he had always ignored. The children ran. Nancy knelt, holding his hand, tears in her eyes. The church, God, everything she believed in, seemed to converge there. That scene was transformative, not just for him, but for her. When John woke up, Nancy said the marriage could continue, but not as before. Nothing could erase those lies. She proposed they stay apart for a while, with a mediator, someone who would listen to both of them. Emily hugged Nancy. Susan cried. And a tenuous peace began. But the basement held even more. Beneath the floorboards, Nancy discovered property maps, construction plans, and names of accounts in tax havens. John seemed to have harbored even more lies. And the question remained, how many layers of double life were there? Nancy, in her faith, prayed for light. Lord, reveal what is still hidden. And in the silence of the night, she heard a whisper. Something ancient. A secret so deep that it might destroy everything if it came to light. She knew she couldn't keep it to herself. He sought legal help, hired an investigator, and examined bank documents. The investigation revealed John's connections to shell companies. Money was being sent to offshore accounts. Margaret seemed complicit. The church community reacted. Some supported Nancy, others had their doubts. Rumors began to circulate. Some believed Nancy was exaggerating. Others condemned John. Nancy felt torn between shame and strength. But one thing was clear, she had chosen the truth. The future was uncertain. Forgiveness might come, but only with justice. Nancy prepared to divide her assets, to separate her finances, to rebuild her life without the shadow of secrets. And, more than that, so that Emily could have her truth. And even as she made plans to rebuild, one final twist, She found a letter from John, written years ago, saying he loved Nancy despite everything, that he never wanted to hurt her, that he believed hiding certain things was to protect the family's peace. Words that hurt and comforted at the same time. As she held that letter, Nancy realized that peace would come not from lies, nor from silence, but from the courage to live in truth. And that truth, however painful, carried a light that not even the darkest basement could extinguish. Ever since Nancy met Margaret in person, something about her seemed different. It was more than guilt. There was a hidden tenderness in her eyes, an old pain Nancy never expected to see. Margaret was, in her own way, a woman torn between love and guilt. A woman who lived in the shadow of broken promises. And Nancy wondered, who really is this woman who stole her husband's secrets? Margaret grew up on a farm near Asheville, North Carolina, the daughter of teachers, with an older sister who always stood out. As a child, she learned to love quietly, because loving loudly was scandalous. Her first love was forbidden, her first dreams cut short. She carried within her the belief that service was her mission, even if it meant serving lies. And it was this past that shaped her. As a young woman, Margaret had a brief friendship with John, still in their teens. But what seemed innocent became confusing over the years. She secretly admired him, kept letters he didn't even remember. He talked about marriage, about plans. She believed him. But when they parted, John left promises. Margaret held out hope. And the most amazing thing of all, she never showed any resentment until that encounter with Nancy. Margaret had a dual identity. To the family, she was Nancy's discreet friend, someone who showed up at birthdays and church services, as if she were just an acquaintance. But behind that, she was the one John sought out when the house was dark. She was the one he secretly called. She was the one his soul sought, even as his body swore loyalty. The lie throbbed in every knowing smile. Nancy wondered, how could someone love so much without being recognized? Margaret lived with the shadow of "what if" for days. And that shadow held power. At another community Bible study, Margaret prayed quietly, asking for forgiveness, but also for the courage to tell the truth. That prayer Nancy never heard, until what her heart already suspected was confirmed. The first twist came when Margaret showed Nancy a note John had written to her, saying he would end something when it was safe. Safe? Nancy asked, her voice trembling. Margaret lowered her eyes and explained that John said he didn't want to hurt Nancy, promising to kill the lie when he found the courage. Nancy understood that what no one knew was that John controlled his fears as much as his desires. Margaret revealed that for years she had harbored guilt of loving a married man, of participating in other people's lies. She didn't want to hurt Nancy, but her love grew like a silent tumor. And the surprise, she said she presented Nancy with only the crumbs of conscience, while the intact lies remained hidden. Nancy felt like screaming, and also crying. Despite this, Margaret was the one who gave Nancy the evidence. She was the one who opened the safe. She was the one who left traces. Why? Because, despite her fear, she believed Nancy deserved to know. Margaret said, "To love with your back to the truth is to hate without realizing it." Nancy was shocked. The woman's love behind the lie had made invisible sacrifices. Margaret also revealed that John had promised to leave everything behind when she, Nancy, retired from the church, when she was more free. This promise was made many years ago. Nancy never knew about it, because John believed she would never find the courage before then. And the biggest twist, he had purchased properties in Margaret's name while telling Nancy they were family investments. In the community, Margaret remained silent, attended women's church meetings, helped elderly women, and carried banners of charity. Everyone saw her as a sister in faith. Few suspected that her shoulders carried secrets. And this maintained a constant tension. The woman who helped and smiled, who welcomed and prayed, hid a deep wound. Nancy had flashbacks of old encounters, dinners with friends, Margaret at the piano, praying together at the altar. Anchor points that once seemed normal now seemed like camouflage for guilt. Memories trembled with new meaning. Nancy thought about how many times she'd ignored signs. How many times she'd chosen to believe the best. What if that belief was part of the lie? Margaret said that years ago, she tried to distance herself. She made plans to move to another city, forget John, and rebuild her own life. But when he told her she was his anchor, that Nancy and the children would only see her as a church sister, she returned. because love drew her closer. And what no one knew was that Nancy's silence encouraged the dissimulation. It also turned out, the second twist, that Margaret had kept letters from John in which he told her that if she ever spoke too much, he would destroy her reputation. If the secret ever got out, he said he would tell the entire community lies about Margaret being vengeful. This terrified Margaret for years. She lived on a tightrope between morality and fear. In one of these moments, Margaret saw Nancy crying alone in her room. She felt remorse, and considered telling her everything. But John called, insisted on meetings, and gently threatened to leave everything behind if she made a fuss. And Margaret, out of loyalty to the past and fear of the future, remained silent. Nancy never knew Margaret to hesitate between being an honest wife and a silent accomplice. Margaret confessed that, over the years, she was consumed by doubt. Did loving Nancy also mean loving John? Loving the church? Loving peace? But all of this took its toll on her soul. She began attending faith therapy groups for women dealing with guilt. And she found echoes of herself there. The hope of redemption. The surprise was discovering that so many other women carried similar secrets. When Nancy heard this, something shifted inside her. It wasn't just betrayal, nor just deception. It was a complex human story. Of fear, of promise, of desire, of guilt. And something no one expected, Nancy felt compassion. A different kind of love, not romantic, but that of a sister, of a suffering human being. Margaret taught Nancy to forgive human imperfections, not as if lies were acceptable, but as if true healing came from acknowledging pain. And Nancy, in prayer, surrendered her indignation to God, not to erase the pain, but to understand what God was teaching through it. When the community began to hear rumors, Margaret trembled. She considered leaving the church, disappearing. But Nancy held her hand at a Sunday service, unannounced. She was simply there. And that, for Margaret, was a helping hand. It was silent grace. And the twist, the condition for reconciliation, could come more from solidarity than punishment. Nancy realized that the woman behind the lie had often been a victim, as much as an offender. A credible offender, a victim of her own emotions, of broken promises, of fear of what people would say. And that broke Nancy's heart. Because loving someone who hurt you is sometimes about accepting that the other person has also suffered. And yet, Margaret had, long ago, saved Nancy's money. She had bought expensive medicine for Nancy's daughters when her family had gone through a crisis. Small acts that Nancy valued, but never associated with guilt or secrecy, and which now seemed like shadows of generosity hidden behind lies. Nancy wondered, what is forgiveness? Is it forgetting? Is it accepting? Is it allowing? Or is it walking with dignity, setting boundaries? And she decided she needed to chart a new path, one where truth and compassion walked hand in hand. The climax of this topic occurs at a community gathering after the service. Nancy, standing at the pulpit, puts into words what no one else had dared to say. She reveals calmly but forcefully, it wasn't just betrayal, it was a concealment of the soul. The congregation listens, some sigh, others weep. The silence weighs heavily. The entire church bears witness to what happened behind the scenes. Margaret, present, ascends the altar after the service. Her voice breaks, she admits her part, asks for public forgiveness. She mentions the letters, the promises, the fear. The community listens. Many are surprised, others defend Nancy. The tension explodes like a storm. And something in the entire structure of the church shatters. The appearances, the judgments, the whispers. But there's no such thing as instant forgiveness. Nancy knows this. She hears voices of support, but also voices of criticism. Margaret receives looks of pity, but also of disapproval. Nancy stands firm. She chose the truth. And she believes there is redemption, if there is genuine confession. Margaret visits Nancy at home after the service. He brings a box with all the tickets, receipts, and memories he saved. He says, I'll hand them all over. Not to justify, but to cleanse. Nancy feels a faint hope. Something new blossoms, not hatred, but the idea of rebuilding. Perhaps together they can create something that goes beyond the pain. Meanwhile, something unexpected, an old friend of Margaret's appears, Clara, bringing a letter from a third party, someone who knew everything. This letter said that Margaret had been pressured by John, that he threatened to tell lies about her, and that many of Margaret's actions had been under psychological duress. Nancy reads the letter. Margaret's face lights up and blushes at the same time. And the next topic promises, because if a woman behind the lie was also a victim, what will happen when all the pieces are revealed? When the entire past is brought to light? Nancy braces herself. The next chapter will expose what John did not just out of love and fear, but out of control. She woke before the sun, feeling a weight on her chest that she couldn't even name. The first rays of light filtered through the curtains and revealed ancient shadows on the bedroom walls. The silence seemed to scream. She wore a faded pink robe, the aroma of coffee wafting through the house. And in every fine dewdrop, Nancy saw her reflection, small, trembling. No one saw the tears she shed after lunch, hidden behind the sink, or the hands that trembled when they touched the porcelain cup John had given her for their anniversary. She prayed for the world to return to normal, for laughter to return. But laughter seemed lost, and something inside her was breaking her falls. She avoided the large mirrors in the hallway. She felt every rug reflect her unhealed pain, every gray hair a scream. Nancy believed smiling would do something, comfort, perhaps forgiveness, but seeing his face reminded her of his smiles with another woman. Her stomach churned, and the pain spread, silent, invisible to others. At night, when the house was eerily quiet, she expected to hear his footsteps, the creak of the door. Instead, she heard the clock ticking away, rhythmic, cruel. She thought that if she closed her eyes, perhaps she could avoid the memory of the kiss, the look, the lie. But the memories invaded her dreams. Sometimes she woke up screaming softly. She made a mental list of all the small losses, every hug that ceased to exist, every loving word that never sounded again, every gesture of tenderness that became a cold routine. She shared these with God in inner secrets, and the hope, tenuous, that he saw, that he felt, that he healed, even if no one else noticed her wound. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, she watched her grandson run and laugh with another man, his husband. A man who wasn't John. Nancy smiled inside, but cried outside, because his laughter reminded her of her own, once upon a time. And that ignited another pain, the knowledge that her best days seemed to be behind her. How many summers had she wasted thinking everything would be okay? Then came a twist. She found in John's coat pocket a small letter, addressed to no one, with only beautiful, intimate words. "You're the only one who understands me." It could have been poetry, some kind of compliment, if it weren't for the shock of seeing those words addressed to a woman she didn't even know. Poison mixed with shock. Nancy slammed the letter shut. She felt the paper tear slightly, a painful metaphor. The smell of old paper, of faded ink, seared her consciousness. In the kitchen, a cup fell and shattered. The sound of broken glass, a symbol of something that would never be repaired the same way. The house seemed to breathe sadness. She isolated herself. She denied visitors. She avoided phone calls. She punched pillows with pent-up frustrations. Friends asked if she was sick. She said it was just fatigue. But the fatigue was in her soul. Her body vibrated with waves of helplessness. And she wondered how many invisible supports she needed to build to keep from sinking. One Sunday, during worship, she looked at the pulpit, the hymns, the choir. The music soared, beautiful notes, united voices, and everything inside her tore apart. The harmonies that once brought peace now weighed heavily like memories. She understood that even in holy places there were shadows, and that her pain was invisible as smoke, yet dense. Weeks passed. Nancy slept late, woke early. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of sorrows. She remembered the promises, the vows of love she had made before God, John's gaze at the altar. What if he had betrayed them not only with another woman, but with silent lies, with financial secrets, with a hidden daughter? Every possibility hurt. She began writing in her prayer notebook, verses, tears, questions. Why, Lord? Where did I go wrong? Where is he now? To whom does he speak? She thought of God as a silent companion, someone who didn't speak but was present. And for the first time, she felt a spark of indignation within the silence of faith. Another twist. One rainy night, the rain pelted the window like shrapnel. Nancy looked outside, saw the house's reflection awash in droplets. And in that reflection, she saw John talking to Margaret. A ghost, a delusion, or a real vision? Thunder drowned out her screams. The world seemed to confirm what her heart already knew. She wanted to run to John, confront Margaret, demand an explanation. But something paralyzed her: fear of ridicule, shame, and the coming loneliness. After all, who would believe her? Some friends would say she was exaggerating. Others would say she was out of her mind. The invisible pain could be dismissed as illegitimate. Then Nancy fell ill. Not a visible illness, but a sadness that ached in her chest, causing insomnia. She felt palpitations, a loss of appetite. Her body reacted to the betrayal as if it were an attack. And no one saw her pulses, her sleepless nights. It was as if her heart had a fever, and the blankets over her were insulation sheets. Margaret showed up at her door one afternoon, saying she wanted to talk, to ask for forgiveness. Nancy listened but didn't touch. Silence answered. Still, her presence ignited another flame of pain, knowing that the person who had helped construct the lie was now asking for mercy. Nancy watched, restrained, tears cooling her expression. But a major twist came. It was Margaret who discovered a letter from John, not to her, nor to Nancy, but to someone unknown, expressing regret for having lied. He claimed that loving slowly was a method of survival. This letter was hidden for months, forgotten, until Nancy found it in an old book. And its contents shattered new pieces of her soul. Nancy collapsed on the living room floor. The letter trembled in her hand. The sound of her crying reverberated off the walls. The carpet seemed to catch every tear. She raised her eyes to the ceiling, asking God, "Why so many lies?" And the answer, utter silence. It was then that she understood that God allows some pain not to hurt more, but to teach. She regained the strength to get out of bed. She poured herself some coffee and went out onto the balcony. The morning chill kissed her face. The scent of dew, pine, and pine trees in the distance. She took a deep breath. She felt that pain, though still alive, could be a companion. No longer a total enemy. On a cold Sunday, she went to church. She sat in the back pew. The choir sang hymns of praise. And everything inside her shook. The voices, the instruments, the sound of knees, they reminded her of other Sundays, when love seemed safe. She closed her eyes. She prayed that, even in the unseen pain, her faith would be seen. As she listened to the sermon, she looked at the lit candles on the altar. Each flame flickered. Each flame represented hope and fear. And she realized that her pain had faces, that of a young, happy Nancy, that of a hurt Nancy, that of a Nancy who now had to decide whether to stay or leave. At the family lunch, John appeared and tried to soothe her. "Nancy, I can explain." He held out his hand. She avoided it. She stood firm. The pain was there, in his calm voice, in his gaze that no longer held trust. The table grew tense. Under plates and silverware, lies were spoken between mouthfuls of silence. She saw her children's discomfort. Susan held her hand under the table. Emily stared at the dishes as if seeking distraction. Nancy pondered, "If I tell them everything, I might lose more than the chance of love. I might lose my family." And that possibility hurt more than knowing she'd been betrayed. Another twist. It was discovered that John had told the congregation lies about Nancy, that she was more fragile, more anxious, that she was going through something. Some believed him. Others were prejudiced. Nancy understood that the betrayal had reached not only her heart, but also her reputation. She considered leaving the church, moving to another city, starting over on her own. But something inside her, a spark of dignity, said, "I'm still a child of God. I still deserve dignity." And there, in the church pew, with eyes turned, she said a silent prayer. The climax of this topic came when Nancy, during a special end-of-year service, asked to take the pulpit. The congregation fell silent. She spoke. Her firm voice trembled, but she never wavered. She recounted her pain, infidelity, lies, injustice, with tears many had never seen. Tears in her eyes saw the pain. John, sitting in the back, broke down in tears. Margaret heard every word. The community wept with her. Some looked surprised, others guiltily. And Nancy, in that moment, knew that the pain no one saw was being revealed with dignity, with truth. But closure wouldn't come today. Nancy left the pulpit with firm steps, but the future was open. There were glances, questions, judgments, hope. She knew that healing wasn't forgetting, that forgiving wasn't allowing one to remain deceived. And a gentle doubt lingered. What will be the next step when the truth, finally seen, demands change? She entered the church that Thursday morning as if it were just another moment of devotion. Soft light filtered through the stained-glass windows, the scent of incense, the sound of discreet harp whistles. Nancy sought solace in the old oak pews, unaware that the unexpected was already heading her way. Eyes she hadn't seen in a long time were about to meet hers. An encounter that would change everything. The song begins, Amazing Grace, and the congregation joins in softly. Nancy closes her eyes, letting each note sink into her chest. She hears footsteps. A soft murmur. Someone sits beside her, Margaret, the woman who carried so many questions. Her heart falters. What could she expect from that moment between faith and pain? Margaret whispers, "Thank you for letting me in." Nancy doesn't respond immediately. Her body wavers between forgiveness and refusal. At the altar, the choir continues. The priest raises his hands. Margaret holds hers, low, almost furtive. Nancy feels an old weight shift within her, fear of another deception, but also a sweet curiosity. Soon after, a twist. The priest announces a special testimony from a woman in the community, someone who was hurt by someone she loved. He doesn't name her. Her voice echoes through the hall, "I was betrayed, but God gave me the strength to see the truth." Nancy looks at Margaret, sees tears shining. Did he know? Did she know? Margaret raises her hand timidly, as if asking permission. She walks to the pulpit with controlled steps. Nancy feels the ground tremble beneath her sock-clad shoes. Silence in the congregation. Gigantic. Margaret begins to speak in a firm voice, her story mingling with Nancy's pain. She reveals her role, her failure, her fear, but also her faith that insisted on shining through. She says she tried to escape the guilt, prayed 1,000 times, asked God for forgiveness, but never had the courage to confess everything. She says she loved John, even knowing about the marriage. That she kept a promise he wouldn't keep. The rumor spread like wildfire, that John would never leave Nancy. But Margaret took a deep breath. The truth hurts, but it heals. Nancy observes each person's expression. Shock, pity, disbelief. Children huddled in pews, women clutching handkerchiefs. Men turned away. The wind hits a side door, vibrating a stained-glass window. Colored light cuts through the air. Margarita, she thinks her name in a nearly silent voice, looks at Nancy. "Forgive me," she whispers, her voice breaking. Another twist. An elderly woman, known for her wisdom in the congregation, Mrs. Harper, stands and says something no one expected. "We all here judge little, love little. But God loves more." She asks the community to welcome Nancy, to welcome Margaret, to consider human pain. The sound of breathing changes. Hearts tremble. Nancy feels tears welling up. Not of anger now, but of recognition. Of being seen. Of being heard. And something no one knew. A tenderness wells up inside her, not for everything that was done, but for everything they were, all too human. Forgiveness emerges, timid, but real. Margaret, overcome with emotion, reveals something that shatters her even more. She kept an old photo of Nancy as a young woman, from when they were still friends. John had given it to Margaret, telling her that Nancy deserved to be happy. The image is sweet and tragic. It shows a smiling, fulfilled Nancy, far from shadows. Nancy sees, recognizes, and cries. She asks the priest if she can go up to the altar. The congregation holds its breath. Nancy hesitates. But she does. Margaret stands nearby. Nancy holds the microphone. Her voice falters. "I lived for many years thinking I knew everything. But there are secrets that wound the soul." The voice of a woman who has carried too much weight. A respectful silence replaces the murmur. And then an unexpected twist. John enters the church. He wasn't praying. He was following her, looking for Margaret, perhaps wanting to undo something he could no longer hide. He stops at the side door. His face pale, the expression of someone who's seen his own shattered reflection. Nancy sees him. Shock runs through everyone. Sharp anticipation. What will he say? Margaret accuses him of lying before the congregation. Her words are measured, her voice firm. She reveals that he bought a house in her name, that he kept secret accounts, that he lived a double love. John tries to interrupt. He chokes. Some in the congregation stand, others bow their heads. Silence is a heavy matter. Nancy closes her eyes for a moment, takes a deep breath. She feels God there as never before, pain and truth together, but also a promise. Nothing hidden remains hidden in the light of faith. She turns to Margaret, takes her hand. The community watches. Then John begs, "Nancy, forgive me." His voice trembles. Tears. He admits it. He doesn't try to justify it. He just admits it. Nancy feels revulsion, pain, but also something like mercy wanting to be born. It's a moment that seems infinite. Margaret falls to her knees, weeping. Nancy feels old grudges piercing the ground, but also that an invisible bridge of redemption is forming. God seems to smile at her effort to stand in the truth. The congregation sings hymns. Voices intertwine. Nancy hears, "It is well with my soul," echoing. Each note seems to lift a part of her fallen life. The church walls vibrate. The high ceiling seems to bless. The sound of many sisters' footsteps coming closer, hugs, outstretched hands, healing visible in silent gestures. Nancy had rarely felt so alive. The pain wasn't gone, of course. The wound was there. But for the first time, she saw that she wasn't alone. That the community, instead of judging, had bowed a little, in prayer, in compassion, in service. And that this could be the beginning of something new. Another twist. Her daughter Emily, who was in the congregation, stands up to defend Nancy. She tells those present that she saw the truth, helped evaluate the evidence, that no one deserves to live amid lies anymore. Her voice echoes, strong, surprising. Nancy sees her and feels a sweet pride. The family united in truth. Susan, a lawyer, also proclaims that Nancy deserves justice and respect. She talks about contracts, documents, and the return of what was hidden. The congregation listens, some with shock, others with relief. Justice comes through faith. The climax comes when Nancy, at the altar, before the assembled congregation, raises her hands and says, "I'm not here to hate. I'm here to live in the light." Everyone falls silent. The heavy silence becomes worship. Something supernatural is in the air. John pleads one last time, Margaret sobs, and Nancy decides she will leave that church today, not as an exile, but as a redeemed woman. She walks confidently from the altar, though her knees tremble. The community follows with glances, prayers, and tears. But the outcome of this encounter doesn't end everything. As Nancy walks down the church aisle, she looks back. Stained glass windows break the light into prisms. An unknown man leans against the pew, someone who's been watching in the corners, a former friend of John's, who may hold an important piece still hidden. Nancy feels the chill of mystery. Even after everything she had discovered, Nancy sensed something greater was coming. Something beyond human hands. On silent nights, she felt a presence, a gentle peace, as if God spoke in whispers on the wind. This was no ordinary revenge. It was divine justice, the kind that heals, that reveals. And she knew, even if her birth of truth was painful, this moment would bring liberation. One morning, John disappeared. He hadn't gone to work or a date. His car was in the garage. His coffee sat unfinished on the table. No warning, no phone call. Nancy tried calling him, her daughters, nothing. A practical emptiness set in. And with it, a reversal. Perhaps that absence was the answer she'd been praying for, even though it hurt. Days passed. Margaret appeared, saying she didn't know where John was, but she handed him a letter left for her. In the letter, John admitted he was lost, confused, and unable to continue living among lies. He asked for forgiveness, for help. Nancy read it with trembling hands. The paper reeked of guilt. And it seemed to be the beginning of something God was working, something bigger than herself. Then, as if timing followed a divine plan, Nancy received a visit from the local bank. An officer alleged that John had used forged documents to transfer assets in someone else's name. Money was being reversed into her account. Secret assets were frozen pending formal investigation. Human justice aligned with divine justice, something she had only dared to imagine. Margaret was instrumental in this justice process. She brought financial evidence, photos, and emails. Susan, her lawyer daughter, filed a lawsuit. Nancy felt that each piece of paper was a stepping stone God was placing in her life's reconstruction. The pain was still there, of course, but so was a faint sense that God was honoring her patience, her faithfulness even in the pain. An unexpected turn of events. John suffered a serious fall while driving alone, crashing his car. No direct human fault, but a consequence of his own negligence, delays, inattention, emotional guilt transformed into distraction. He woke up in the hospital with bruises and confusion. Nancy learned of the accident from Margareth. Divine mission or coincidence? Her heart wavered between fear and compassion. In the hospital, John looked at the machines, the blinking ICU lights, the nurses around him. He muttered something about Margaret, lies, that he felt everything was falling apart. Nancy had been there. A widow of illusions, but alive in faith. She didn't reject him, she simply stood by, holding his hand. Tears and prayers mingled. And God seemed to be restoring something invisible. Meanwhile, the church community began to see the fruits of this justice. People who had previously judged John now supported Nancy. The pastor spoke of the value of truth, the weight of lies, but also the power of repentance. They prayed for John, for Nancy. Hymns were sung softly, hugs were offered. Justice that heals generates communion. Emily, the discovered daughter, also went to the hospital. She brought simple flowers, broken words of love and pain. John recognized her with a broken voice. In his eyes, Nancy saw remorse that seemed more sincere than she had ever felt. Her stepdaughter's presence seemed to spark a new awareness in John. Divine justice was opening paths where only darkness seemed to exist. Another twist. John, after weeks in the hospital, suffered a minor cardiac arrest. A shock. Margaret prayed, Nancy prayed, Emily prayed. Priests visited him. He, amidst his weaknesses, said he felt as if God had called him to account, not in public, but before his own soul. Nancy felt the weight of this moment, that perhaps this was the turning point. When John left the hospital, still frail, Nancy didn't rush to hug him. She waited. She needed to see change, to see truth externally. He proposed marriage therapy, spiritual counseling, financial restitution, and meetings with mediators. And Nancy, despite her fear, agreed to take steps. Because divine justice isn't about taking everything away at once, it's about rebuilding with honesty. Margaret also suffered consequences. Her reputation was tested. Some accused her of complicity, others began to view her with mercy. She accepted her failure, faced human judgment, but remained steadfast in her confession. Nancy realized that true divine justice often works through those who humble themselves in truth, not those who seek to be right. Susan filed a lawsuit to recover property, so that Nancy would have the right to hidden assets. A judge approved a temporary injunction. Money was temporarily returned. Some neighbors saw Nancy depositing checks, signing documents, and naming offices. Some people whispered, "Finally, she's getting what's rightfully hers." And Nancy, looking at all this, prayed that it wouldn't be just revenge, but fair reparation. John gradually began attending services with fewer excuses. He prayed in public, watched Nancy pray. He admitted his sins before church leaders. The congregation saw tears Nancy had never seen, and prayers she had never heard from him. This brought hope. And also fear. Would it last? A major twist. A former friend of John's, someone he often used as an accomplice in his lies, came to the church and confessed to helping with the schemes. He brought documents that not even Margaret had. He revealed that John had offshore accounts. The scheme was bigger than anyone had imagined. Legal action was taken, and the investigation expanded. Nancy saw that the truth had deep roots. At Sunday worship, the pastor spoke about Jeremiah. If we confess our sins, he is faithful to forgive. Nancy sensed that this phrase wasn't generic preaching, it was a message for her, for John, for the entire church. The choir sang, "Amazing Grace." Voices choked, hearts open. God took this to himself. Then John, in tears, gives a testimony. From the pulpit, before the congregation, he speaks of every lie, every secret kept, every night of guilt. He asks forgiveness from Nancy, Emily, Margaret, and the church. Nancy listens, weeping. The truth finally exposed. Divine justice manifested not just as punishment, but as restoration. A wave of quiet blessings began. Neighbors who had previously avoided Nancy brought food. Church colleagues offered help with home repairs, gardening, and companionship. The community felt compassion. Nancy recognized that God used others to restore her worth. The human embrace was part of divine justice. Margaret finally gave Nancy the final letters and papers, including a document in which John denied the secret acts. They were notarized. Nancy received formal restitution, and her property was legally recognized again in her name. Legal and spiritual justice met like two streams of light. At the climax of this topic, Nancy is invited by the church to give a speech of regeneration, not revenge. She speaks of pain, guilt, love, and redemption. Her voice echoes throughout the packed church. She says that divine justice doesn't always correct evil externally, but purifies the heart. That God doesn't remove scars, but uses them to tell stories of victory. But there are still unresolved fragments, secrets John may still harbor, emotional consequences even Nancy can't foresee. While legal justice has done its part, spiritual justice has also transformed her intimately and quietly. And Nancy knows this theme will continue in the next chapter. Not just about justice, but about rebuilding, not back to what was, but toward something new. Every day, Nancy woke up, and her first thoughts went to church, to prayer. She realized that her faith, once a routine, was now all that remained as a foundation. The stained glass windows, the hymns, the hands raised in prayer became light in the dark spaces of her heart. And even with her chest heavy, she believed that God could still transform pain into purpose. She began reading the Bible again, with a new thirst. Psalms spoke of affliction, Jeremiah spoke of renewal, Matthew taught of mercy. Words that had once seemed distant now slammed home. Each verse was like a breath of hope, and something inside her said, "You are not alone." She attended prayer meetings with women from the church. Each session was a tearful affair, testimonies intertwining. Friends shared stories of forgiveness, healing, miracles both small and large. Nancy heard stories of true faith that felt like balm, and she began to speak little but listen deeply, absorbing every word as if it were living water. A twist. During one of these meetings, a woman named Ruth handed her an old Bible, inscribed with inscriptions from Ruth's long-deceased mother. Words handwritten in the spaces between the covers read, "May the light find your heart." Nancy, reading, felt a strange warmth. It was as if God had prepared this gift decades ago for this very moment. Nancy began to pray differently, prayers of gratitude, of surrender, of righteousness. And what no one expected, one morning, she woke up without that lump in her chest that seemed to tighten her throat each day. Peace, tenuous, but real, came to her. She didn't say anything to John right away. She kept this gift from God to herself. She began sharing small testimonies with friends and neighbors. She told how she had uncovered secrets, how she had endured betrayal, how her faith had not been broken. Some listened with shock, others with tears, some with disbelief. But each time she spoke her truth, an ancient part of her was freed. Another twist. Someone from the community, a woman who always seemed cold, approached and confessed to the sin of judgment. She said she had been judging Nancy for weeks, hearing rumors. She asked for forgiveness. Nancy reached out. She believed that the strength of faith wasn't just resilience, but also the humility to embrace those who had hurt her. She began serving. She visited sick people, brought soup, and prayed in homes. Nancy felt that God was using her to heal other wounds, not erasing her own, but using them to bring comfort to others. And in that, she found purpose. Something no one expected. Pain can become bridges. Her daughter Susan, who had previously served as her legal guardian, began accompanying Nancy in church ministries. Emily did the same. They offered public support. Nancy preached short reflections at women's services, speaking of truth, of trust in God. The church saw her faith, saw transformation. At a sunset service, Nancy sang, the entire choir, the guitars, the twilight streaming through the windows. And during the hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness," her voice broke, her soul torn with emotion. Ordinary tears, of people who have suffered. And when she finished singing, she felt God heard something profound. And that moment signaled that faith was not just comfort, but action. Then, a striking turn of events. John appeared at a service with a different expression, less defensive, more humble. He took a microphone and apologized not only to Nancy but to the community. He spoke of his hidden actions, of how guilt gnawed at him. Nancy saw him cry. The congregation fell silent. Their faith together felt reborn. Nancy was afraid of being deceived again. But it rang true. The fear built up by years of secrecy didn't disappear overnight. She prayed for discernment. And God gave her clarity, small, coherent actions, concrete gestures. Words accompanied by change. Margaret also participated in this new chapter of faith. She didn't absolve herself of guilt, but she volunteered to serve. In services, in women's groups, in community prayers. She received mixed looks, some understanding, others critical, but she remained steadfast. Nancy learned that faith that serves even when not praised is mature faith. There were plenty of moments: financial crisis, dark circles under the eyes, days of doubt. But Nancy clung to the promise of Philippians that speaks of contentment in all situations. She prayed, "Lord, teach me to trust when everything seems to be falling apart." And each day, she learned anew that trust isn't the absence of pain, it's persistence in pain. An unexpected twist. She dreamed of her deceased mother telling her that her strength came from the same source that sustained generations. It was such a real dream that when she woke up, she decided to visit her grave and pray. There, she felt a cold but comforting peace, as if the roots of her faith had grown deeper. Afterward, Nancy began composing a letter, not to John, nor to Margaret, but to God, giving thanks not for all that was good, but for all she had learned through the pain. Word by word poured out, shame, betrayal, but also forgiveness, freedom, faith. And in that letter, she saw her soul drawn, vulnerable and precious. She read this letter to Susan and Emily at an intimate family gathering. They cried together, prayed together. Nancy felt her faith was uniting, not dividing. And that family communion, though fragile, felt like the work of God. Climax. At a Thanksgiving service, Nancy walked up to the altar. The church was packed, faces familiar and unfamiliar, the lights dimmed, and incense hung in the air. She raised her arms and spoke, "Today I choose to no longer live under the shadow of lies. I choose truth, I choose the faith that has healed me, I choose life." The hall erupted in applause and tears. John knelt beside her. Margaret did as well. Their hands were outstretched, he asking for forgiveness, she accepting it with dignity. Nancy felt that faith was no longer fragile, it was rock. And yet, the outcome of that moment wasn't the end. Nancy knew there would be days of weakness, doubt, and shock. But now, she had faith that wouldn't waver so easily. The community saw it, the family saw it, and she saw within herself a light that lies could never extinguish. As she walked out of the church that night, through the side door, Nancy looked up at the starry sky. She whispered a prayer, "May my tomorrow be guided by you." And the gentle wind seemed to answer. And here is a hook for the next topic, because faith brought strength, but restoration requires rebuilding, not only of the heart, but of homes, reputations, and broken bonds. The missing granddaughter was Emily, but Emily was more than the name everyone knew. It had been years since anyone had heard from her directly. Susan's younger sister, Ellen, was said to live far away, not respond to letters, and had moved to another city. During birthdays and family services, her face was remembered only in old photos. Nancy always felt a longing that no one saw, a longing to share secrets, affection, and trust with Emily. One day, Nancy got a phone call, a young voice on the other end, saying, "Grandma, it's me, Emily." Her heart leaped. Surprise mixed with old fears. Was it true? Was it a scam? Was it possible Emily was so distant, so silent, so silenced? She thought of all the unanswered messages, all the ignored emails. And now someone was saying, "Grandma, find me." Nancy knew this call would change everything. Emily explained that she lived in a university town hundreds of miles away, that she was studying art and living in an apartment with roommates. She said she had avoided contact out of shame, anger, and feeling that her family was already too divided. She said she preferred to disappear rather than face more lies. Nancy felt anger, yes, toward Emily for her silence, but also compassion. She understood that silence can sometimes be a shield for those who have been hurt. When Emily proposed a visit, Nancy arranged to meet her at a small coffee shop in a Philadelphia suburb. Autumn leaves rustled in the wind, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries. Emily arrived late, eyes red, hands trembling. Nancy hugged her tightly. It was like reconnecting the pieces of a broken mosaic. But something in Emily's expression told her she had more to reveal. Emily brought a small suitcase, something that looked heavy, a briefcase. Inside were photos, recorded voice messages, hidden correspondence. She said she had proof that John, her grandfather, had tried to reach her several times, had sent notes, that Margaret had interfered to prevent contact. That the silence was not by choice, but by intervention. Nancy felt the shock. There were more culprits than she had thought. The first twist, Emily showed recordings of conversations, a man's voice saying, "It wasn't time," that "they don't understand," that "tomorrow everything will be better." Words Nancy would recognize as John's. But also recordings of Margaret saying that Emily didn't deserve to suffer anymore, that it was best to leave her alone for now. The pain welled up again. The deception had been layered, layers of protection that hurt. Emily revealed that during the years she was away, she was approached by legal representatives. Letters she never saw were sent by John's family, saying he would change, that he wanted to reconnect. But they never reached her address. Margaret avoided them. Emily, over time, believed Nancy was distant by choice. The mutual silence grew. And that silence was, in the end, more painful than any lie spoken. Nancy listened, followed, felt every knot in Emily's chest. She thought about how alone, rejected, invisible she felt. And this brought a new emotion, guilt. Because Nancy also blamed Margaret, John, but she wondered if, in her own pain, she had missed the care Emily needed. Remorse mingled with compassion, with a desire to rebuild. Another twist, a letter Emily wrote in her youth was intercepted, sender Emily, address cropped, and returned by mail as not found. Margaret never told Nancy this. John said he tried, but Emily sensed he wasn't. This made it clear it wasn't just her decision. There were manipulations. Nancy asked, how many other times had they lied to Emily or withheld the truth? They went together to Emily's apartment, Nancy, Susan, and Emily, facing the geography of young life, the notebooks, the art prints, the scattered old memories. Emily showed a painting she had done as a teenager, a self-portrait. "I see myself among shadows," she wrote on the frame. Nancy was silent, tears streaming down her face. That painting was a confessional. It was art and pain stitched together. At a service at Emily's church, Nancy was invited to share. When she took the pulpit, she held the microphone shakily. She shared part of Emily's story, part of her own. The congregation heard victory and hurt. And the moment Nancy said, "My granddaughter suffered alone," something broke in the heart of the community. Support welled up where there had been silence. John also appeared at this meeting. He confessed that he had always loved Emily, was ashamed of his mistakes, of his omissions. That he had always wanted to make amends. That he had forgotten that love without action is a lie. Nancy saw John cry, but she also saw Emily look at him with pain, with a desire for justice, not naive reconciliation. Margaret apologized sincerely, looking Emily in the eye. She said she believed she was protecting her, but that her protection had hurt. Emily listened, cried, but still hadn't forgiven. "Forgiveness is my right," Emily said, her voice strong, "not my obligation." Nancy felt a deep sense of pride. Her missing granddaughter had reappeared, with her own voice. No longer a silenced child. Climax. Emily decided she wanted to participate in the legal action to protect her rights, to receive recognition, reparations, perhaps financial aid for the lost years. Susan presented documents, testimonies. Human justice seemed aligned with moral justice. Eyes turned to her. Finally, Emily was part of the visible truth. An even bigger twist. It turned out that Emily, during the years she was missing, had befriended a faith blogger, someone who recorded the stories of hurting women. Emily had written anonymously about her pain, poetry, prayers, testimonies, and someone recognized her voice. That blogger left a comment saying, "If this is your grandmother, thank her, because your story changed my life." Emily realized that her pain was no longer hers alone. It resonated. Nancy realized that restoration didn't mean erasing the past, but accepting who Emily was: an artist, a wounded daughter, a granddaughter, a woman who suffered. And also, someone with the power to inspire. The missing granddaughter had become a powerful voice. God, somehow, had used her absence to hone her voice. Meanwhile, Emily invited Nancy on an art trip to New York, an exhibition where she would showcase her paintings, some based on themes of pain, lies, and revelation. Nancy hesitated, afraid of exposure, afraid of judgment. But she gathered her courage. After all, if Emily could bare her soul, she could be present at her granddaughter's side. At the airport, Emily and Nancy walked together, suitcases packed, nervous laughter. Jet lag. They exchange glances. Emily holds Nancy's hand. Nancy feels the weight of the years lift a little. That carrying the truth together can be liberating. And what no one expected, in that exhibition, a painting by Emily depicts a young Nancy, wounded, but as firm as a tree in a storm. There is power in art. The audience watches, tears flowing, whispers flowing. Some people see their own mirrors in the painting. The title, Broken Roots, True Blossom. Nancy hears someone say, "Is that Mrs. Harper's granddaughter who disappeared?" And Emily recognizes faces, but also recognizes their value. A woman who disappeared reappears, and brings healing. But the encounter doesn't heal everything at once. Emily steps away for a moment at the end of the exhibition, going for a walk alone through the streets of New York. Nancy finds her in the park, sitting on a bench. Emily says, "There are days when I feel safe, others when I feel like everything could fall apart." Nancy embraces her, tells her she's with her, that she no longer needs to fight alone. Vulnerability becomes a bridge between generations. As they walk, Emily reveals another secret. She's discovered old correspondence between John and a mysterious woman besides Margaret. Perhaps someone else involved, perhaps just another shadow. A mystery still unsolved. Nancy looks out at the skyline of buildings, tall lights, neon, urban silence. She thinks, there are still pieces of the puzzle. And there, with her reappeared granddaughter in her arms, Nancy closes her eyes and prays, "Lord, may this chapter be one of restoration, not ruin. May truth set free, but love heal." Something gentle, a breeze, the distant sound of a church bell. She knows the next chapter will bring rebuilding, and perhaps reconciliation, perhaps new challenges, but she feels a real hope blossoming. Nancy sensed a whisper in the air that there was more to John than the betrayal, something that not even the court papers had fully revealed. It was night, dimly lit, candles lit on the coffee table. She looked at the documents she already knew, accounting records, deeds. Even so, something pulsed silently, a secret that seemed to be trying to escape from a forgotten door. She received a certified letter from an unknown law firm. The sender, Family Estate and Legacy, Philadelphia. Nancy's heart raced. Could it be something good? An extra will? An unpublished will? Opening that letter meant facing another layer of John's life she never imagined existed. And fear mixed with hope gripped her. When she opened it, she found something that nearly knocked her off her feet. It was a will left by John's grandfather, her father-in-law, the man who so rarely attended family gatherings, always shrouded in silence. The document stated that part of his estate would go to Nancy if John died without claiming it. It was a completely unfamiliar clause. She read further. Among the assets included was a vacation estate on the coast of South Carolina. An old house, with emotional and historical significance for John's family, pictured in old summer photos, where he had been a boy, running on the porch, fishing at sunset. The house belonged to his grandfather, who always said it would one day become a peaceful home for Nancy if she needed it. Nancy held the paper tremblingly. Silent tears. The twist: John never mentioned this clause or the house. Margaret didn't even know the will existed. Susan had never found it in the family papers. It was something as hidden as her daughter's secret. And Nancy realized God had left a legacy of love, silent, even before the scandals. She kept the letter and prayed for discernment. She didn't want to accept it just for financial gain. She wanted justice, yes, but for this inheritance to be used for healing, not to resurrect pain. And something unexpected happened. Margaret appeared with a box of old papers, saying that her grandfather always spoke of Nancy when he was alone. That he had written letters, plans he never delivered. Among these papers, Nancy found notes mentioning Church Women's Federation, shelter for the elderly, residence for wounded families. Her grandfather had left part of the property for this purpose. The house on the coast would be the shelter's headquarters. Nancy read it as if God were whispering, "Transform your pain into mission." Another unexpected twist. She discovered that someone had contested the will a few years earlier, a cousin of John's who wanted to revoke the clause favoring Nancy. The document had been missing from a legal safe for months. Susan managed to locate a copy filed in an old notary's office, hidden among papers no one reviewed anymore. Human and divine justice had met again. When Nancy visited the coastal house, walking along the creaking porch boards, watching the crashing sea, she heard the echo of little John's laughter. She saw the peeling walls, old windows, framed photos. She thought, this house, which seemed like nothing but a stage, has always held promise. The salty air gave her peace. And the house held memories and also the future. On a sunny day, she gathered her family: Susan, Emily, Margaret. They brought the will, showed old photos, read notes. Emily wept with joy and anger, because it had been deprivation, loss, absence. But here, the inheritance wasn't just financial. It was identity, restitution, proof that she had been loved, even when deceived. John, looking into Nancy's face, saw there was something greater than forgiveness, acknowledgement. He said he never understood the weight of his grandfather's promise because he had grown up disconnected from that side of the family. The lies and secrets blinded him to something simple. She deserved dignity, she deserved a legacy of history, of memory. Margaret said she felt remorse, that she now understood that her silence hadn't protected anyone. That hiding the truth was stealing from the future. Susan spoke of legal documents, of legalizing the house's deed so it could be transferred to Nancy's name, or of having Nancy take charge of converting it into the community shelter her grandfather had dreamed of. The inheritance also provoked opposition. The complaining cousin took legal action, lawyers appeared, and property disputes arose. Some neighbors resisted, saying the house should be public, or that Nancy had done nothing to deserve it. Nancy faced long-standing criticism and envious looks. But with each resistance, she felt God give her peace and strength to endure. Another twist. They discovered that part of the land surrounding the coastal house had long-standing environmental protection, decreed by John's grandfather, to prevent machinery from destroying the vegetation. This meant she couldn't sell or exploit it commercially. But it would also guarantee preservation and shelter for those in need. A restriction that seemed like a curse turned into a blessing. At the climax of this topic, Nancy held a ceremony at the coastal house. She invited the church, close friends, Emily, Susan, and Margaret. She offered a solemn prayer blessing the home, asking God to use that place for light, healing, and reconciliation. The sea breeze, the seagulls, and the sound of the waves mingled with the songs. Tears, laughter, and hugs. She declared before everyone that the house wouldn't be hers alone, it would be a living legacy. A shelter for elderly women, wounded young women, granddaughters who feel lost, couples who need to rebuild trust. That the legacy no one expected would blossom into compassion. John knelt there, hands trembling, quietly asking Nancy, the family, for forgiveness. He said he saw in her face that his grandfather was right. Nancy was chosen for something greater. He pledged to help, along with Susan and Emily, restore the house, to keep the long-held dream alive. Margaret also promised to serve, to care for the shelter, to welcome stories, to participate in the loving work. Nancy saw in her expression a new surrender, no longer hiding secrets, but sharing the mission. But not everything was resolved. Her cousin was still pursuing lawsuits, lawyers were poring over old documents, there were subtle threats from sellers wanting to buy the land, neighbors wanted to turn the place into a tourist resort. Nancy knew that maintaining this legacy would require vigilance. She feared being usurped, of losing what was finally rightfully hers, of her hidden past being unraveled. She prayed for protection. She must maintain legal firmness, but also faith to not let fear steal her peace. She also questioned, "Am I worthy?" A piercing, human doubt. But each embrace, each testimony, each prayer strengthened her certainty that God chooses not by merit, but by grace. In this new chapter, Nancy felt that the inheritance became a bridge between generations. Herself, her daughters, her granddaughter, and other women from the church and the community who came to the coastal house seeking refuge. The house became a symbol of healing, more than possession. And something still remains undisclosed. Ancient documents speak of another, even older will, perhaps written by the grandfather's father, which mentioned spiritual legacy, sermons, letters, diaries, that could reveal more about the family's character and choices. Something Margaret and Susan promised to pursue. Nancy looked out to sea, to the horizon, feeling salt, wind, memory. She knew that this unexpected legacy was more than just possessions. It was an invitation to rebuild love, dignity, and truth. And that her mission was not to end pain, but to transform pain into service. She sat on the porch of the coastal house at dusk, gazing out at the ocean horizon. The wind carried the scent of salt, pine trees, and memories. Nancy wanted to cry for what was no longer. She also wanted to smile for what was emerging from the ashes. She knew forgiveness would have to come, not just from her, but from many broken hearts in the family. Her children gathered around her, Susan, Emily, even Margaret. They all had silent stories, hidden guilt, long-held fears. The silence between them trembled with emotion. Nancy took a deep breath, trying to form words that would be worth more than ordinary apologies. Forgiveness needed to sound eternal, not an occasional gesture. She began by saying, "I know forgiveness doesn't erase lies, but I believe it can break chains." Her voice faltered, but she held firm. She spoke of sleepless nights, of secrets that fractured souls, of invisible losses. She asked for a new perspective. She asked for companionship. She asked for love, the kind she saw in small gestures, to blossom again. Margaret wept, holding Emily's hand, Nancy's. Emily trembled. Susan wiped away tears. The atmosphere felt sacred. Then came the first twist. Margaret, in a trembling voice, confessed that she harbored resentment as deep as Nancy's, because loving and lying is doubly torturous. She wanted to forgive, but was afraid of hurting again. And Nancy breathed, knowing that forgiveness is also vulnerability. John stood beside them. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was offering a new commitment of his own. He acknowledged everything: betrayal, omissions, lies. He called each of his lies by name. And he said he was ready to live in truth, to rebuild trust, even knowing it would take time, that some wounds never fully heal. There was a moment of absolute silence. Only the sound of distant waves, birdsong, the distant laughter of children, perhaps grandchildren running on the sand. Nancy looked at each face before her: Susan, Emily, Margaret, John. Each one brought pain, but also a desire to rebuild. She saw something new in each of their eyes: sincere regret, a desire for change. Another unexpected twist. Emily, still emotional, stated that she would forgive, but on the condition of complete honesty, that everything that came to light should be visible, documented, and open. She didn't want to rebuild in the dark. Nancy and John accepted. Susan proposed a family pact: monthly transparency meetings, joint prayer, and daily forgiveness. The climax came when Nancy stood, stretched out her arms, and said, "May this forgiveness not be just for us, but for all who come after us." May her story serve as a warning, a comfort to betrayed women, to granddaughters who felt absence, to families who grew up on lies. She declared that forgiveness is strength, not weakness. John knelt before her and apologized, looking her in the eye. Not out of convenience, but out of remorse that shook him. He said he had understood too late the value of honesty, of transparency, of the fact that love without truth is a prison. Nancy accepted his request on her knees, a symbol of humility. Everyone joined in silent prayer. Margaret also knelt. She asked for forgiveness from Nancy, from her family, from herself. She spoke of her fears, of her wrong choices. She said she wanted to become an instrument of healing, not of silence. Nancy took her hand, and in that gesture, something moved: forgiveness woven not just with words, but with surrender. Tears flowed, of pain, of relief, of hope. Her soul was weary but alive. Nancy thought of Christ's words, "Forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me." And she understood that this model was more than liturgy, it was life. Forgiveness became a bridge, not a wall. There was soft, almost shy laughter. Susan joked that now John would have to pay for coffee at meetings. Emily, between sobs, said she wanted to paint something to express this new peace. Margaret promised to plant rose bushes in the garden of their coastal home, flowers that would require care, like trust. A lightness emerged in the unexpected laughter. Another twist. An old friend from church approached Nancy, saying they'd seen her testify on local radio and in an online forum, and that her story had reached women in different states. Some sent letters saying, "You gave me the courage to step out of the shadows." Nancy realized her forgiveness resonated. That her pain, transformed into words, could free generations. Neighbors watched, some came to ask questions, offer help, and provide practical support. Fixing windows, cleaning the garden, bringing food. The community came together in an act of love. Nancy saw that forgiveness has an expansive effect. No more cycles of hurt, but circles of care. Inner climax. Nancy meditated alone on a clear morning, praying in the garden of her coastal home. She felt the sun warm her skin, saw the roses begin to bloom. She reflected that forgiveness is not a single act, but an ongoing process. That each day would be part of rebuilding what had been broken. John showed up, cleaned the porch, painted the walls, and worked to preserve the house that was now more than a memory. Nancy saw humility in him, but she also saw fragility. But together they learned, fragility can be a meeting point with grace. Margaret planted roses in the garden, seemingly conversing with each flower. Emily drew beside her. Susan oversaw documents. Nancy watched it all and understood that reconstruction requires constant presence, small gestures, patience, honesty, day after day. A final twist. Nancy discovered that the cousin contesting the will had dropped the case. Perhaps by seeing it, perhaps by hearing the family's testimony, perhaps driven by something greater than ambition. Legal justice stabilized. And Nancy realized that victory, in this case, lay more in peace than in possessions. Dusk fell. The sky was turning orange. Nancy, John, Margaret, Emily, and Susan sat on the porch. The silence was broken by the sound of the waves. Each held a cup of tea. And Nancy said, "Thank you for every step that brought us here." Her voice choked, her soul torn, her heart open. She looked at Emily and smiled. "You've come home, not just physically, but to reign in our story." Emily took her hand. Nancy felt a new chapter begin, one where forgiveness wasn't just a word, but a path. And something still remains in the shadows, unanswered questions, scars that will never fade, memories that will return unexpectedly. But Nancy knew, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to love despite it. She said a silent prayer, "Lord, may this forgiveness be a light not only for us who live, but for generations to come." The sun cast its golden reflection over the sea. Perhaps tomorrow would bring doubt. Perhaps the world would once again wear lies. But today she stood firm.